Aloha everyone, my name is Kanani Kea. Welcome to the State of Hawaii Department of Transportation's 2020 Protect Our Water Conference. I'm your moderator for this morning's session titled Evaluating and Managing Contaminated Soil. All sessions will be recorded and available to view on vFairs for 30 days following the conference. Presentations can then be found at stormwaterhawaii.com or on the Stormwater Hawaii YouTube channel. Please use the Q&A feature during the presentation to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, the speaker will have a few minutes to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. Roger Brewer is a senior environmental scientist with the Hawaii Department of Health. His environmental experience includes regulatory compliance audits, characterization of contaminated land and sediment, contaminant fate and transport, vapor intrusion, and human health and ecological risk assessment. He has worked as an environmental consultant in the US, Asia, and South America, and as a senior geologist and environmental risk assessment specialist for the California EPA. Since 2005, Roger has focused on the development of decision unit and multi-increment sample site investigation methods as a replacement for less reliable, discrete sampling methods. His academic background includes a PhD in geology and postdoctoral research at Nanjing University in China. Sven Lindstrom has been with the Hawaii Department of Health since 2017. He is the primary state regulator overseeing DoD military munitions response program sites under the DoD State Memorandum of Agreement Cooperative Agreement. In 2019, Mr. Lindstrom took over the Voluntary Cleanup Program Specialist position, so he now also manages the state's Voluntary Response Program. Mr. Lindstrom has a BS from UC San Diego and has been working in environmental science in Hawaii since 2008. Please help me welcome Roger and Sven. Roger, I think you can share your screen now, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so thanks. My name is Roger Brewer. I'm an environmental scientist with the Hawaii Department of Health. So today I want to start off just giving you an idea of what environmental consultants do in the field and how the regulatory agencies like our office can assist in this. I know that environmental projects, my consulting days and even regulatory days, tend to be a small part of large construction projects, but they can create big headaches. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience can attest to. So I want to give you an idea of what actually happens in the field and how to prepare ahead of time to avoid some of these problems and get a general understanding why having an environmental consultant on board is so important. I always like to start some of my workshops and I have this note pinned to my cubicle wall just to remind me. There's three methods to gain knowledge. The first, reflection, is the noblest. The second, imitation, is the easiest. And the third, experience, is the bitterest. So I like to think of reflection as what we're doing now when we get together to talk about some of the problems we're having or some things that are going right. What is it? What we need to work on. The second, imitation, I think of as the guidance that we put together collectively to ensure that things go as smoothly as possible in the field. And then third, experience, especially the bitter kind, we want to try to avoid. But when it does happen, then that gives us a chance to learn and improve our guidance, and so we don't have the problems the next time. So like I mentioned, and I'm sure you know, the environmental aspects of large construction projects tend to be fairly small in terms of budget, but they can cause a lot of problems. You know, one issue is that the projects actually require quite a bit of expertise in multiple fields. And that's what tends to make them so complicated. So I like to think of it as this: the chemistry can tell you what it is, what chemicals are we concerned about, or contaminants. The geologists tell you where it is, the physicists tell you where it's going, the toxicologists tell you what it can do to you, the bugs or bunnies or humans. Then it combined, you know, what are the concerns? What do we really need to be concerned about this or worried about it? And if so, then the engineers might come in and determine how to fix the problem. And I always like to throw in the attorneys at the end. They get to figure out who gets to pay for all this stuff. So all these different fields of expertise are incorporated into the guidance. When you see one or two people going out into the field to do some work at your project, they have all these different fields or expertises in the back of their mind when they go out there. So they have to be highly trained. It's a niche industry. You have to whole purpose. You have to get in with a lot of expertise and get out, and try not to compromise the projects. This is all incorporated in our guidance. We have 3 different guidance documents out there. The first, referred to as the Technical Guidance Manual Office publishes, just describes how to test soil, water, and air for contamination. A lot of details, a lot of experience in the field built into this. The second guidance document, one is especially I tend to focus on, is determining if there's a problem. It's referred to as evaluation of environmental hazards at sites with contaminated soil and groundwater. So once you collect a sample of soil, water, air, or whatever, you're always going to find something. And there's traces of something in every sample you get, but at what point does it become a problem we need to be concerned about? We have a lot of webinars posted on our webinar webpage, presentations on different topics, and training courses recorded for both these topics, collecting samples, determining if there's a problem. One document we put together, especially for the construction industry, construction projects, is testing of stockpiles and fill material. We worked on this in coordination with our solid hazardous waste office. They oversee off-site transport of waste at sites, which could include soil that's contaminated above our action levels, different chemicals. So as you're definitely aware of in the audience, a lot of soil moves around on these construction projects, and it can be a big headache if you don't plan ahead for testing the soil and making sure that it's properly managed so it doesn't disappear and go somewhere where it shouldn't. We also do a lot of work in addition to road construction, utility work, and of course with the Hart Rail project, a lot of dredging projects also, which can include huge volumes of soil or of dredged sediment, either disposed of special site offshore or reused onshore for different projects. So we have very specific means for testing of these materials, determining if they can be reused or not. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail on how this is done, just to let you know that information is out there. So the collection of soil samples and sediment samples is actually fairly simple. The first step is you designate what we call a decision unit area and volume of soil or sediment for testing. So think of a stockpile or some area, and that's the volume of soil you want to test. You want to get a single sample from that soil. There's specific limits on the area and volume of soil can be included. And you'll collect a sample from 30 to 75 points within that volume of soil. Each point we refer to as an increment. You combine all these increments of soil together, prepare a single multi-increment sample. It's going to be a half gallon to a gallon in size. Then you send that to the laboratory, and they're going to process it, sieve it, air dry it, and such very carefully, and then test it for the target contaminants of concern. And you compare that to our environmental action levels. Sometimes we'll go out, any project would do one area 3 different times just to make sure we're getting it right and we get the same answer each time. So we have special sections specific to stockpiles, and that they can be huge problems. The best way to test a stockpile or soil that you're excavating is to test it as you're moving it. So the environmental consultant could grab a sample from each truck as it goes by, or as the soil is being dumped into a stockpile, they grab a few increments, a few handfuls of soil, and to prepare a larger sample for it. And we have very specific guidance on what volume of soil can be included in any single sample. It depends on where the soil is from and how it's going to be reused. So if you want to have unrestricted reuse of the stockpile of soil, then you'll be limited to collecting 1 sample per 100 cubic yards as a start. Anyway, that's somebody's residential yard with 6 inches of fill material in it. So we want to be sure the contaminant levels are low enough they wouldn't pose a potential concern to children and such. For dredging projects, we can get 800 cubic yards or even several thousand cubic yards if we don't suspect the soils or sediments contaminated to begin with. We have specific guidance on that and how to spread the stockpiles out for sampling, or how to cut faces off of large stockpiles and progressively sample them as the soil needs to be reused. A lot of this has to do with balancing cost of testing versus cost of disposal. And as I'm sure everyone's aware now, we're running out of places to dispose of soil. So it's really important we be able to test it efficiently and cost effectively for reusing it. So we have a lot of detailed guidance on how to collect soil samples, and it may seem kind of simple, but it's actually a very specific protocol you have to follow when you're collecting samples from soil. One thing you want to make sure is if somebody goes back and tests the same soil, they get pretty much the same answer you did. That's what's causing a lot of problems, especially on the mainland now, where people have tested soil at properties and thought it was clean, but they didn't collect the samples properly. And now bankers, lawyers are requiring the soil to go back and retest it, and they're finding contamination and such. So how you collect a sample is very important. And we have a 6-part training series posted to our YouTube station on how to set up investigations, how to collect samples, how to process them at the lab, and then how to determine if you have a problem or not. That's on collecting samples. Once you've collected the samples, and the first thing we do when we get a report from you is instead of just looking at your conclusions, we look at how the samples were collected to make sure you followed our guidance and did it properly. And assuming all that went okay, the next thing we would do is determine if there's a potential problem with any contaminants identified in the soil. And you'd identify what contaminants to test for based on how the property was used in the past. And we tend to focus on contaminants that are toxic and persistent, like lead or PCBs or arsenic, other types of chemicals. We also deal, of course, with a lot of petroleum contamination. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we have very specific environmental concerns for contaminated soil and contaminated groundwater that we try to look for at every site if it's applicable. For contaminated soil, the first thing we think of is kids playing in the soil. So we refer to that as direct exposure, even adults being exposed to contaminated soil every day, or construction workers. So that's direct exposure. If we're worried in some cases about ecotoxicity to flora and fauna, that's a separate topic we would look for. It's not very common in projects in urban areas. Big issue in Hawaii is leaching of contaminants from soil and contamination of underlying groundwater, especially since we're totally relying on groundwater for drinking water and such. Other problems posed by contaminated soil, if there's gasoline or solvents, and if it's high enough concentrations of contamination, you could have vapors coming out of the soil and getting sucked into overlying buildings, referred to as vapor intrusion. That can be it's usually a very localized but important issue at places like gasoline stations and dry cleaners. A big issue with contaminated soil is what we refer to as gross contamination. We'll look at that again in a minute, where your soil could be dripping in fuel or something. That causes lots of problems at projects. That's for contaminated soil. For contaminated groundwater, a similar set of potential environmental concerns. Most people initially think of drinking water contamination, but most of the construction projects we have in Hawaii and along the coastline areas, we're not really affecting a source of drinking water. The first groundwater you encounter is not a source of drinking water. But we are concerned about discharges to aquatic habitats into nearby canals and such, especially during dewatering projects. And if it's high enough concentrations of solvents and such, we could have vapors coming out of the groundwater getting into buildings. Again, a big issue is this free product on the groundwater and gross contamination. That tends to be the biggest problem in construction projects. So for each one of these concerns, we compile environmental action levels, the concentration of a contaminant in soil. Above that concentration, it could pose that specific problem. So we refer to a lot of guidance published by the US EPA. We modify that for use in Hawaii, especially for human health risk concerns. For ecotoxicity concerns, if it's discharges to aquatic habitat, surface water, we have promulgated standards for contaminants in surface water that could pose problems for aquatic organisms. If we're concerned about terrestrial habitats, then that's really a site-specific ecological risk assessment. You have to get a specialist to come in. It's very rare. Leaching of contaminants to groundwater, we look at guidance published by Massachusetts, which works fairly well in Hawaii. And the big thing is gross contamination. Again, guidance published by Massachusetts quite a while back. And this especially tells us when we could have problems with odors and short-term vapors and heavy contamination in the soil. I like to focus on contamination. This is my last consulting project before I start working as a regulator in California EPA. This site was a former gas station. It had been declared no further action was necessary. Essentially been declared clean by the state. At the time, I was a regulator, and they had dug up the gas station, been shut for 20 years, and they dug out most of the contaminated soil. They were putting in an underground parking garage for a big some office complex. Just I can't tell you where the site is, some large state on the West Coast, you can probably guess. Well, I was actually in my office reading the report for the site, and the consultant was out there, and the report I was reading said everything's fine at the site. And my coworker calls up and says the site's on fire. So how can that be? And that's this is in the 90s. We were totally missing this high concern of what we call now gross contamination. But the gasoline vapors in the soil were so high that when they drug the backhoe through it, then the soil would catch on fire. It'd set off sparks. They had to get a remote control backhoe out there, and you can see these poor consultants out there in their Tyveks with fire extinguishers. Not a job I'd want to have. So something that interferes with most construction projects is when you dig into petroleum contamination that you weren't anticipating. And you'll get high short-term vapor emissions that could cause a lot of problems with your neighbors. In some cases, I haven't really seen this in Hawaii, you could get explosive vapors. Mobile-free product, all these stuff that mucks up your equipment. And then you have all this soil and groundwater you suddenly have to deal with. So you really want to identify this stuff ahead of time for any construction project, know where it is, and be ready to deal with it and include it in your budget. And we refer this to environmental hazard management plans. And I think Sven is going to talk more about that. So here's just an example of these environmental action levels that I oversee for our office. This is the concentration of gasoline in soil that could pose these specific problems. So when can you smell gasoline in soil? We're around 100 milligrams per kilogram concentration. If you get data back from the laboratory saying you have 500 milligrams per kilogram gasoline in the soil, you should be able to smell it in the soil. It gives you some idea when you're out there, you're about to do construction work, be ready to encounter this gasoline stinky soil. That's about, a drop of gasoline weighs about 25 milligrams, so 100 milligrams per kilogram. That's about 4 drops in a double handful of soil. And then you have to get up to higher concentrations to pose, real direct exposure concerns or leaching concerns. And there's other ways you have to look at potential vapor concerns to buildings. So we have all these action levels for gasoline in soil, and same thing for groundwater. When does gasoline and groundwater become toxic if you're drinking it every day? Well, over about 300 micrograms per liter, which is roughly about the level you can taste it. Under gross contamination, 500 micrograms per liter, that's a taste and odor threshold. So you're never really going to be exposed to gasoline contaminated groundwater without knowing it. It's going to taste really bad. And then if this gets into your aquatic habitat, about the same concentration, above 500 micrograms per liter, which is 3 or 4 drops in a 50-gallon drum, then it could start posing problems to fish and other aquatic organisms. So those are action levels. We have about 150 different contaminants listed. And our guidance tends to cover most of the common pesticides, heavy metals, petroleum, solvents, explosives that we see here in Hawaii. And there's a lot of details on how each one of those action levels were derived. This is all put together in a pretty easy to use Excel-based, called an EAL surfer, electronic lookup tables, where you select your site scenario. Is it residential or unrestricted land use, or commercial, industrial? What's the groundwater use? Then you can select the chemical by the name or the CAS number, input site data, and it'll automatically tell you if you have a potential problem at the site and what that specific problem is. And then it'll generate a very short summary of the origin of the action levels and potential concerns. So this really helps you incorporate all this expertise very quickly up front in a project to help the environmental aspects of the environmental consultants to get in and take care of their issues and get out of the way of the construction project. If your concentrations are below these action levels, you don't have any problems. If they're above, it doesn't mean you specifically have a problem, it just means you need to look at it in more detail. And a lot of times it's just not possible to completely clean up sites, especially when you're dealing with widespread petroleum contamination or some of the contaminated fill material here in Hawaii. In that case, you have to map out where the contamination is, what the potential problem is, and then prepare some type of long-term environmental hazard management plan that describes how to manage the contaminated soil and groundwater over time during construction projects and in the future. So I'll finish up with this, just a quick example. It's semi-hypothetical. Some people may recognize this property. It's actually the Lowe's store on Nimitz. There's the old warehouse building to the right. And then on the bottom area here was the former Gasco complex where they made benzene and other chemicals. Now it's a shipping company. But this site used to have above ground storage tanks where they stored gasoline, especially, and some other fuels for decades, I think since the early 1900s, heavily contaminated with petroleum. So in this case, to kind of jump ahead, the environmental consultant would have gone in and collected soil samples, groundwater samples, and then in soil vapor samples where they're testing the vapors in the soil, which the site I showed you that caught on fire, if we tested the vapors, we would have known immediately that we had a problem there, but we didn't. We do now. And then you create what we call an environmental hazard map of the site, which you see here. the area highlighted in red is where it's so contaminated you could have vapor problems if you put a building on top of that. Gross contamination in yellow. If you dig into these areas, you're probably going to hit oily contaminated or gasoline contaminated soil and groundwater, which you have to deal with. And deal with runoff, you have to deal with vapors and such coming out of it. And then, so skipping over to the purple area, this is the area of groundwater where it's contaminated at high enough levels with gasoline that you can't just discharge the groundwater into a stormwater drain. You have to do dewatering during the project. So ideally, the construction folks would get a map like this for any project and working with the environmental consultants. They need to determine what to do at the site. Which of these, we can't clean it all up most of the time. So you would take out in this last slide, in this my example, it's actually pretty close to what they did at Lowe's. You take out the really heavy contamination, the stuff that's going to cause vapors to come into your new Lowe's store. You don't want that to happen. This contamination, try to take out as much of that as possible so that when people go in and do work in the future, or even during redevelopment, to prep a site for construction, get out all the gross contamination so that you don't have to worry about vapors coming out and your equipment. And then the rest of it, you have to manage in place. So you know where your contaminated groundwater is, you utilities there below groundwater table. You have to dewatering. You know you have to do something with that groundwater, either store it and put it back or treat it. These are all part of long-term management plans or construction management plans. In the case of Lowe's, if you ever go there, then walking around, especially on the home garden side of the building, look up at the roof. You'll see these little fans, little whirlybirds. And at Lowe's, what they did, contamination, but there was still a chance that methane might build up under the slab of the building and under the parking lot over time, just from the petroleum degrading. So they put in a vapor barrier under the slab of the building, like a membrane. And under that barrier, they put in a venting system and ran it up to the roof that just allows air to flow under the slab of the building and continually pull the methane out. One of these engineer controls you incorporate into your construction projects. But again, you want to do it up front, include it in the budget. You don't want this to come in at the last minute and you suddenly tell your design people, well, by the way, you need to jack the building up 6 inches, put a vapor barrier under it. That's just a quick idea of how samples are collected in the field and kind of the role of the environmental consultant and all the expertise that's required just to do a job properly so you can get in and get out without delaying projects. And also we talked about how to evaluate potential environmental hazards. In the 90s, when we were doing this, we had to look at every chemical site by site, every sample case by case. On average, it took 1.5 years after they collected the data to determine if there was a problem or not. And that's when we started publishing these environmental action levels with EPA. Now we can do it in, I like to say, 30 seconds instead of 1.5 years. It's a very critical part of the project. And then in step 3, once you've identified the problems, always get the developers and construction people involved from the start. Include this in their project plans so that projects can go smoothly. So that's it for my side of the presentation. It's kind of a background, the guidance and such we have, and the basics of what's going on in the field. So next, I'm going to switch over to my coworker, Sven Lindstrom, and he'll give you some more details on actually working on specific projects.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Appreciate that. I hope everybody can hear me. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sven Lindstrom, and as Kanani said, I'm the voluntary cleanup specialist for the HERE office. I work in the Site Discovery, Assessment, and Remediation, or SDAR section. Roger gave a pretty detailed description of the sampling process and risk assessment. I'm going to try to present a broader overview of how to identify and manage contaminated soil and groundwater during construction projects, and specifically how to identify and plan management of environmental hazards before construction begins to avoid delays to the project schedule. This slide lists our state environmental response law, HRS 128D, and the state contingency plan, which is Administrative Rule 11-451. These are the laws and rules that give us the authority to address environmental hazards and cleanups, or what are called response actions. Under the law, we have authority to act whenever there is a release or threat of a release of a hazardous substance, contaminant, or pollutant that may present a substantial danger to human health and the environment. I've also listed here some of the guidance documents that Roger mentioned, which include the HERE Office Technical Guidance Manual, our EHE guidance, and our clean fill guidance, which describes the appropriate sampling methods required to characterize soil for disposal or reuse. Ideally, you'll be able to identify whether or not there's contaminated media at your project site before excavation, construction activities begin. There's several tools that can help you determine this. Phase 1 environmental site assessment is a process to evaluate the potential for contamination to be present at a site following EPA's all appropriate inquiries rule. Our iHear database provides the public with online access to sites with identified environmental hazards and related documents. So this is a screenshot from our iHear system. Observations made during pre-construction geotechnical borings can also identify potential contaminants, as can a call to our office to discuss your project in advance with one of our staff. We'll be happy to work with you. We'll likely recommend that you do a phase 1 if you haven't done one already, to collect some basic background information on the property. And finally, you can collect samples in the areas where excavation will occur to determine whether contaminants of potential concern are present. The phase 1 environmental site assessment should be conducted following the ASTM standard 1527. It should include a review of regulatory records in state, federal, and local databases, as well as a review of historical records, historical maps, and aerial photographs if they're available. In addition, it should include interviews with current and past property owners and with owners and users of neighboring properties. The purpose of the phase 1 ESA is to identify what are called recognized environmental conditions, or RECs. RECs are indications that there may be contamination on the property or on adjacent properties which could impact your site. For example, if the site was formerly a gas station or a dry cleaner, there may have been historic releases that occurred that impacted the site, or historic records may show that there was a leaking underground storage tank on a neighboring property with the potential to impact the site. RECs are not confirmation that contamination is present, but they should give you pause to consider whether environmental hazards may be present. They can also help identify where on a property those hazards may be. If RECs are identified on a property, it's prudent to conduct further investigation prior to redevelopment. Another place to look is the HERE Office's, sorry, skip the slide again. The HERE Office's online database, iHear. With iHear, you can use the viewer to scan a Google Earth-like map or type in your property's address to zoom to it and check to see if your property or nearby properties are in our database. Each site in our database is displayed on the map with either a site centroid or a site boundary. And by clicking on the site or typing the name of the site into the search box, you can access all the regulatory records in our database for review. Some of the sites may have already been cleaned up or may not have conditions that will impact your project. So you will have to review the records to determine that. In the future, we're planning to add other features to iHear, such as the site status, which will let you know whether cleanup is completed or not, site priority ranking, what types of contaminants are present, what institutional and engineering controls may be present. But for now, the iHear is still a work in progress, which basically just provides for you the document. So you have to go in and do the hard work of reviewing it yourself. But slowly but surely, we're going to get there. So, unfortunately, historic and regulatory records are not always complete. So even if you do your due diligence, there may be unexpected contamination at your site. There's a few more steps that you can take to help ensure that you identify any environmental hazards that may be present before construction sites. Occasionally, when collecting pre-construction geotechnical borings, the drillers will note smells or staining in the soil, or even free product floating on the groundwater. Developers should review the boring logs and talk to the drillers, because these discoveries could indicate that there is contamination at the site that needs to be addressed. You can also call our office and talk to one of our remedial project managers to discuss the project. Our RPMs have a lot of knowledge about environmental conditions across the state, and we can help advise you whether a site investigation is warranted. For instance, areas like Kaka'ako and Iwilei that have been industrial areas for decades may have subsurface contamination, even if you don't identify a specific wreck at your site. Former ag land can also have contamination in the old pesticide mixing areas that may impact your site. So if you're planning a project in one of these areas and you aren't sure how to proceed, you should give us a call. And finally, of course, there is sampling. The first and most important step to sampling is to hire a qualified environmental consultant with experience in investigating the types of conditions that are at your site. We published a helpful fact sheet called How to Choose an Environmental Consultant that we recommend you review and follow in selecting your consultant for the project. There's a link here, and we also have that on our website. Hiring the wrong consultant in an attempt to save money could end up costing much more money down the line if work has to be redone, and especially if construction has to be stopped in order for the work to be redone. Your consultant should prepare a sampling and analysis plan that identifies the areas to be investigated and the contaminants of potential concern, and a plan for collecting samples that includes assigning decision units and multi-increment samples in accordance with our TGM guidance, which Roger just explained a bit. Simply drilling 3 boreholes and taking discrete samples of soil from each borehole to try to identify the presence of or absence of contamination is rarely sufficient. And finally, analytical results should be screened against the most stringent Tier 1 environmental action levels for unrestricted or what's called residential use. Even though your site may be commercial industrial site, if the contaminant concentrations exceed unrestricted EALs, then there will still have to be a plan to manage or remediate the impacted media, either before, during, or post-construction. We highly recommend that you have your consultant submit the sampling and analysis plan to the HERE office RPM so that we can review it before you begin the sampling. Discoveries of contaminated media during construction is something that you do not want to have happen to you. In most cases, construction will have to stop so that the hazard can be assessed, and the project plans may have to be revised around addressing the contamination somehow. When contamination is discovered at your site, you must call our office immediately, and our on-scene coordinators will determine whether an emergency response is warranted. If it is an ongoing release from a damaged pipeline or something, they will help stop the release and contain it. Then once the release is contained, or in the case of historic contamination that is not posing an immediate threat to human health and the environment, our OSCs will generally then hand off the site to our SDAR section for follow-up oversight and management. In order for us to determine how to proceed, we'll likely need to collect samples in order to characterize the nature and extent of the contamination. That is, we'll need to know what the contaminant is and how large of an area is impacted. Before construction can resume, at a minimum, a construction environmental hazard management plan, or CEHMP, will need to be prepared by your consultant. The CEHMP documents what is known about contaminants at the site and what sort of hazards they represent for site workers and the public, similar to the hazard map that Roger showed you earlier. It also provides project-specific guidance about how the contaminated media must be managed during the construction and how to properly dispose of any soil and groundwater that will not remain on site. Fortunately for you, we recently completed preparation of a CEHMP template that your consultant can use to develop the CEHMP, which ensures that all necessary information will be included in the plan and puts it in a format that will be easy for the HERE office to review. The template is available at this website listed here. And again, you can also link to it from our homepage. Using the template to prepare a CEHMP is not required, but it is recommended. We also have a few other types of EHMPs, as Roger mentioned. The site-specific EHMP is often prepared for a property that has had a remedial removal or a response action where a portion of the contamination was left behind for one reason or another, like at that Lowe's site. The EHMP provides general instructions for managing the contamination in place, including any engineering and institutional controls that must be maintained. And it provides basic soil and groundwater management guidance for small-scale activities that may disturb impacted media, such as emergency repairs. Large-scale redevelopment of the site, even if it has an EHMP, it will generally require a project-specific construction EHMP as well. The picture you see here depicts a plume from a release at a Navy oil pipeline pumping station in Pearl City. The Navy is managing this residual contamination with an EHMP. The yellow sort of blob shape there depicts the plume of gasoline in the groundwater. In fact, DOT is currently planning some storm drain work in this area that is within the plume area. However, since the plume is only in the groundwater in that area where DOT's work will be conducted, and the project won't be that deep that it encounters groundwater, there's no need for a CHMP for their project. If the project did extend into a significant portion of the impacted groundwater plume, then preparation of a CHMP would be appropriate for this DOT project. We also have programmatic and area-wide environmental hazard management plans that address large areas that may be impacted by contamination, which may come from multiple sources. This figure is from the Evelay District Programmatic EHMP. AHMPs provide general guidance for worker protection and soil management across the area, but actual conditions may vary widely in different portions of the area that's included in the area-wide EHMP. Specific parcels within the area may also have their own site-specific EHMPs. For example, in this figure, the pink areas, each of those have their own EHMP. And the programmatic EHMP in this case only addresses small-scale projects in the roads and other infrastructure areas, not the individual privately owned parcels. AEHMPs, area-wide EHMPs, also are not designated for large-scale developments, so a CEHMP will need to be prepared. You can call our office if you're not sure whether a construction EHMP is required for your project or not. The rail project also has a programmatic EHMP that covers the excavation activities at various parcels along the route, but only at the portions of the parcels where HART is doing construction. Another example is the Waikoloa Maneuver Area, Area-Wide Environmental Hazard Management Plan. And this covers over 100,000 acres in North Kona on the Big Island. You can see a map of that on the figure here. This AEHMP specifically addresses the potential detonation hazard of unexploded ordnance from training conducted during World War II. Excavation activities anywhere in this area are covered by this area-wide EHMP, but specific parcels may also have additional environmental hazards that must be addressed. One of the key elements of all EHMPs is proper management and disposal of soil and groundwater at the site. In most instances, soil can be reused at site, even if it is contaminated, as long as it's not grossly contaminated. However, it should still be replaced in the same area from where it was excavated, and it should not be placed in the groundwater or near the surface if it can be avoided. Soil that will be exported to another site must be screened following our clean fill guidance and our TGM. If the contaminant concentration exceeds the unrestricted EAL, or if the sampling frequency is insufficient, then management will be required at the receiving site, and H2H will have to approve the transport. Soil that goes to the landfill only needs to meet the landfill's requirement for sampling and characterization. Groundwater may also be re-infiltrated on site as long as it is in the same general area as it was extracted from and away from streams or other surface water bodies. Any free product on the surface will first have to be skimmed and disposed of. A discharge permit will be required from the department's clean water branch to discharge into any sewers, either sanitary or stormwater. And another option for contaminated groundwater is to pump the wastewater into drums or other containers for either for treatment or disposal offsite. As previously mentioned, releases must be reported to the HERE office. Failure to immediately report a release of a reportable quantity as defined in HAR 11-451 could result in a fine of up to $10,000 per day. Depending on what was released, there are other agencies that must also be contacted. There's a link here at the top with information about reporting release, which can also be found from our homepage. If it's a historical release and it's difficult to tell whether a reportable quantity, then the best thing to do is to call it into us. You can have your consultant do some further investigation to characterize it, the extent, and then call it in. But in general, any exceedances of the unrestricted Tier 1 EAL should be reported to the HERE office so that at a minimum they can be added to our records. One easy example of a reportable quantity is free product. Any free product on groundwater or observable sheen on surface water must be called in immediately. E-permitting is the system that we use for submitting documents. And again, there's a link here at the top. It's pretty simple to set up an account and password, and then you can submit plans, reports, or other documents. We prefer that you use e-permitting for all submittals to ensure that they get entered into our system. Occasionally, if reports are just emailed directly to RPMs, they don't manage to make it into the database, and that's what we're trying to avoid with submittals directly through e-permitting. In e-permitting, there are 2 links to submit sites to our SDAR section. Submittal of assessment and remediation related documents, that's pretty much all documents, and then a separate one for notification of construction activities, which will not receive any document. For reporting of a release, you want to click on the link in our EP&R section, or Emergency Preparedness and Response section, which is directly below the SDAR section on the website. I guess that's it. This is my contact information, as well as some of the links that I presented here today. And you can also get to them, as I said, from our homepage, which is health.hawaii.gov/HEER. So that wraps up the presentation for today, unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Roger and Sven. I believe we're over the time for questions. If anyone has any questions for Roger or Sven, please use their contact information to ask your questions. So I believe that the next session starts at 9 a.m. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the info desk for assistance. Also, don't forget to stop by and check out the vendors during your break. I just want to thank everyone for their assistance. And please, like I said, don't feel free to reach out to Roger or Sven if you guys have any questions following the session. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.